Welcome to the Belonging Chronicles. This is a production of Revolve Consulting. We are a business dedicated to helping organizations build belonging. In this series, we answer questions that we have encountered in our work with our client partners. I'm Janelle Williams-Melendrez.
I'm Jeff Buckholtz.
I'm Dan Cordero.
And today's question is, what does building belonging mean for a leader in practical terms? You said something, Jeff, that made me think about belonging statements and how we work a lot with organizations and in creating belonging value statements. And these are really important so that everybody in the organization knows what is the value, do we all have a shared understanding, and how does it cascade meaning across our organization so that we can move toward it even better. It's something that's evergreen. You're always working on it. It's never, we finished it and it's done and now it's forgotten in the book somewhere. It's something that you're keeping front and center, I think is a really important thing when we're talking about practical ways of building belonging. How are we practicing this in our meeting? How are we practicing this in our day-to-day tasks? How are we practicing this in our relationships? The other part was this idea of they'll have more grace when we give them feedback. And I want to come back to something Dan said in our session about giving feedback and making the time to compliment one another, making the time to let others know that you value them and their contributions to the work. You value knowing them, being able to work with them. We might think those things, but it takes 4 seconds? I really appreciate you, Dan. I love working with you, Jeff, right? What was 4 seconds? But what is so meaningful, and that helps to build the grace that we might need where we don't have the time and we have to be rushed or we have to give the feedback that doesn't feel really great. That builds that grace pile for us later on.
There's something else that's come into mind for me too, Janelle, as I was listening to each of us describe this. It reminds me of something that I feel like we as a group, as an organization, that we face too, which is we ain't the same, right? We are not the same. We have very different experiences. And I mean, I can't count how many times, right, we're sitting in a meeting and Janelle, you and I are like, that's not what I said. And you're like, well, that is what I said.
That's not what I meant.
That's not what I meant, right? Like we have different experiences. We have different interpretations of things. And so building belonging, especially for a leader, it is really important to be able to pay specific attention to the ways that our interpretation of something is not always going to align with the interpretation of the people that we work with. So it's interesting, right? Because for me, I know this happens as the three of us are working where I get like locked in on the way that I'm thinking about it. And I think that one of the things that we forget to do, I forget to do this, but we've seen other people do it, right? Is that when I'm locked in, I forget to ask the two of you what your spin on it is or what your interpretation of it is. And then we get like 30 minutes later, you're like, but that's not what I meant. And I was like, damn it, if I just asked you what you meant 30 minutes ago. So like, I think that understanding of differences and experiences really helps us understand so much of how to build belonging, because we're not all going to experience belonging the same way. We're not going to get frustrated about the same things, etc. So it's a really important opportunity to ask those questions, learn what people's experiences are, and to just keep in mind that their experience is different and validating that as best you can and trying to elevate the differences in experience inside of your work groups.
I was just thinking about the times we have completely unique interpretations of whatever it is that we're working at. We're at it for several minutes trying to explain to one another, and we're at the end of it realizing, well, we're trying to say the same thing essentially. It's just a matter of how
you're saying that you're saying what I'm saying?
Yeah. But you had me thinking about communication in general. Like, this is something that we've joked about before, because when we correspond, and this happens with everybody, right? Typing styles are different. How we express ourselves in a virtual space, in a physical space, in a digital space, when when you don't have the benefit of someone's facial expressions or their body language. We communicate pretty consistently, and even with the working relationship that we have,
you say pretty consistently, we are always together.
Yeah.
But never in the same physical
right.
space.
But even with that, right, with the consistency of like how often we're working together, like when you send a thanks, and this has happened, we've literally talked about this, where you can be genuinely trying to thank me or share your appreciation for something that I've done or shared with you, and you'll write thanks, either like THX or like THX period, which for me that sends my anxiety feelers going, because I read even just that simple period as like, oh, what did I do? I didn't do something right. And so then my anxiety just starts like rolling down. And meanwhile, just like, oh, I like this. Thanks, Dan. And then moving on with the day, right?
I'm actually glad you said that again, so that I was reminded to put that exclamation mark on there so that it doesn't build anxiety.
I actually have a question. I wanted to ask you both your thoughts as far as leaders establishing what appropriate conduct is in a space, right? Because kind of you were saying, when you're in a leadership position, a lot of that is not just how you are interacting with your colleagues or the people on your team, but in a leadership position, you are also establishing what the norms are or what's appropriate for how people engage with one another in that space. So I kind of wanted to open up that question because that was something I was thinking about and was interested to know how your experiences inform your thoughts on it.
I think that I'm going to go back to something Jeff said. If we've invested in building relationships with people throughout, then that one time that one thing happened in that one space isn't the only time that I'm now giving feedback and trying to correct a behavior. That conversation comes inside of one that is already built inside of a good relationship, where that person, I'm assuming a direct report, knows my intentions, knows that I value them as an employee, knows that I'm invested in who they are, and knows that this is coming from a space of wanting them to be on the side of a great team that builds belonging.
Right.
And so when you already have invested in that and you have those relationships, I think that becomes less of an issue. Not that it doesn't happen, but it becomes less of an issue in correcting behavior because there is already an expectation that we're going to be truthful with one another, which means I want to clarify, building belonging and having a belonging centered team doesn't mean it's one that promotes niceties. It's not about always being nice and polite. It's about being truthful and honest with care, which is different. So I get to have a conversation with you that's honest and truthful, but it's coming from a place that is deeply invested in you, that is deeply valuing of who you are. And so you can receive it in that space rather than not having that relationship and then interpreting it as, oh my gosh, my job's over, I better start looking, right? Yeah. So that would be my thought.
It's the difference between like nice and kind to me are very, very different.
Absolutely.
It's in alignment with my interpretation of the difference of those words, whereas to truly be kind, you have to be willing to invest in difficult moments and difficult conversations in order to truly show yourself and other people kindness, as opposed to being nice. That's kind of where the investment is.
Your question, Dan, the word that kept coming up in my mind was modeling. And I was just thinking of it in the, like that idea that our kids, for example, right, when you're working with young people, you have to be very cautious about the way you do things. You've got like a 2-year-old and you watch your language because you don't want them to repeat words. You don't want them to say what you're saying because that could be really inappropriate for a 2-year-old. Though I would probably find it very amusing if I'm just being candid. But what I heard from you, Dan, was also like that there's forethought put into it. So not just in my modeling in kind of the way that I behave relationally as a leader, but I heard you saying like setting expectations. And I think, did I put time on the agenda for this thing? Have I sent out invites to people for feedback on the proposal that I made during the meeting? And this idea of like modeling and all the things we're talking about are great. They are amplified and made a million times more effective and better if we as leaders have others helping to hold us to account. And I think we would say that's most effectively done in organizations if it's actually braided into your evaluation processes. So if I'm evaluated as a leader on how well I build belonging and the criteria underneath that, then I'm just so much more likely to be motivated to do it because that's how I get my bonus. That's how I get my high fives. But even when we can't build those mechanisms, people listening may be like, that's awesome. I can't change what HR does. There's still ways to ask others and set up accountability mechanisms for yourself. Look to your peers, right? So I'm leading this meeting. Would you watch me and see how I'm doing this and give me some feedback about where you think I did a good job around this or not? I'm about to send an email out to an entire work group. Let me have Janelle look at it, which we do all the time. Yep. I mean, we look at each other's stuff all the time just to make sure that the tone of it is right, that we're prioritizing what we want to be prioritizing in that communication. So I think modeling is a huge part of it. But I also think along with that is this idea of setting goals, telling people what those goals are, and then getting evaluated on it.
I think, you had said we're all different, and that made me think about how the world of work has changed so much since 2020 with COVID. And the idea of building belonging when not everybody works in the same place. They're all working in different buildings, different states, in some places with client partners we work with, even different countries. And yet they're all on one team. And building belonging is still essential because you have one goal. It's that one product that needs to go out. It's that one service that needs to be done. And so I'm going to throw it back out to you all. What are the differences with building belonging now than maybe they were in, say, 2019?
The first thing that comes to mind is that there has to be more effort and direct and deliberate intention, because and this is something that we have heard time and time again. When we have collected data, when we have spoken to people who are in these organizations and talking specifically about belonging and connectivity across the organization, time and time again, we have heard, well, we used to have all of these social events before the pandemic, and now we don't. And now we're either hybrid or we are completely remote. And so, we have a client partner that one of the meetings we did recently, they were sharing with us kind of these anecdotes about these great Halloween and holiday parties that they were able to have beforehand. And the way that kind of they all were energized and talking about that.
Oh yeah,
you could tell it's
sense of community. They were
Yeah.
like, "Oh, do you remember this cake that the person made that was a giant like scary face or whatever?"
like the skeleton, like charcuterie, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind, is one of the biggest differences, I think, is that you have to be so intentional and deliberate, which I feel like is just kind of this returning theme that we kind of keep coming back to across these conversations. But for me, that's at least what I pick up as one of the most blatant differences.
The other thing I think that came out of COVID, at least for me, was, and this is weird because it's the prompt in your question, and I was like, we are different, and that reminded me of COVID, and like, but that is what COVID taught me. We understand like there are a lot of differences in our lives.
Yeah.
And the kind of things we deal with day in, day out. I was thinking about this with one of our client partners. There was a conversation about people who were caretakers for people in their lives. And that obviously during COVID, that became this immense burden, right? And I don't mean burden like because they had to do, but like burden because people were sick and they had all these additional roles in their lives. And so building belonging after COVID, I think requires us to keep in mind that the crap going on in our lives outside of our workspace can be way heavy and way complicated and very different for different folks. For me, that adds a layer of patience. Like if I think about why isn't this done, I'm now constantly thinking to myself, ooh, I don't know what's going on in their life. I don't know. Is Dan sick? Is he stressed out? Like what's going on? And I think part of building belonging is then asking those questions maybe and providing support where you can. But it just came up when you had mentioned that idea of like, what did we learn from COVID? And I think part of what I learned was that not only do we have different experiences, but I mean, like in terms of life burden, we are not all in the same space and that it changes moment to moment.
Yeah.
So it's like you were fine on Tuesday, but Wednesday your kids are both sick. And now what, right? You don't have the bandwidth to do what you were going to do. So,
and I think too, like now, with the way that we operate in this current point in time, even though we're not in a physical space, there is almost, in some ways, an expectation of increased access because even though we're all at home, we're now connecting digitally. Yeah. So the expectation for availability at every point in time, that often conflicts with different circumstances. And then on the other end, it makes it really difficult for people. It creates potentially anxiety for folks who are, well, I am working within my hours or I'm meeting my responsibilities. But if I have somebody on my team who is asking for my attention at 7 p.m., then maybe there's a sense of obligation to answer or a feeling that you're obligated to respond, which is not a sustainable practice for most people.
Our boundaries got really blurred.
Yeah,
with COVID.
exactly. Thank you.
But I think that's right. I've been doing a deep dive into this idea of work-life proportion or equilibrium, trying to look at how that whole thing came about and how it doesn't work, by the way, but also This idea that we need to have control over our use of technology, that the technology is a tool. It's not something that governs us. We have to actually govern it. And we have that's totally out of whack for us. And so what comes to me is this idea of flexibility. When we're talking about building belonging, the two things, what you both were saying, makes me think about the need for leaders to be flexible, to know that you don't know the answer.
That we're managing their expectations.
Yes, absolutely. So you don't know the answer to why your direct report didn't do the task that you asked for.
Or they're
so
not responding,
filling in, or they're not responding. So don't fill in the blanks, right? We're currently witnessing across the world now, not just the United States, the Great Resignation, this idea of quiet quitting. I don't think those are unrelated to not feeling a sense of belonging. I think there's a deep connection there, actually. We're talking about all these things to do with the people that we work with, either as team members and colleagues or as direct reports. But a really important part of this equation is how we're doing that for ourselves. As leaders, we are a part of the belonging equation. So we have to be tuned into where we're at. How close are we to our own edges? Are we full in our capacity? Because if we aren't paying attention to that, it all falls apart. It all falls apart. Yeah. And I think so this last piece I'll say here, when we're talking about practical application, Jeff, you were talking about modeling. Part of modeling is also being able to have better balance with technology, is being able to say, okay, we're ending the workday at 5:30, is being able to say, I'm not going to be sending you text messages on Saturday. I'm not going to email you after 8:00 at night. So having those boundaries, not only to model to your direct reports and team members that they're important and you value them, but to value who you are and your own well-being, because that's just, in my perspective, a critical part of this conversation.
This has all been so valuable. I think what we'll share here might be helpful would be some of the categories that we use. I'd mentioned categories earlier as a way to kind of organize and think through what belonging means. We have several here. I'll just list them.
Operationalizing belonging.
Exactly. Operationalizing it. So we've got self-reflection, relationships, mending relationships, accountability, apologizing, learning about the lived experience of others, decisions, direct reports, and meetings. And so maybe we just each pick one of these things and that people might find useful. I thought that might be interesting for us to do. So let's see here. So under mending relationships, I've got one that I'd always stood out to me, which is I regularly engage with humility when I'm told that I've caused harm. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's one for me. Dan, you wanna pick one?
Well, we were talking about accountability earlier, right? So I think that's one that's probably significantly relevant for this conversation. So in thinking about accountability, here's one. I regularly challenge behavior from team members that damages belonging. And I think that this can be broadly looked upon as looking to hold one another accountable, but also keeping an eye out for your own accountability as well, and opening up those opportunities to be held accountable.
Mm-hmm. I think we talked about this one with decisions. I consider how my decisions will impact team members prior to making them.
Yeah, so these are just specifics. For those of you listening, if you want to learn more of these, we'd be happy to share them with you. But the key here is really thinking through what will help build belonging for your team. Janelle said this earlier. To do that, you need to be clear on what belonging means for your organization and for your team. So you might want to establish those definitions and think about what your vision for belonging is, what those values are. But some of the specifics are helpful at times too. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Belonging Chronicles. So
do it.
Yeah. So thank you to our listeners, and we'll sign off. I'm Jeff Buckles.
I'm Dan Cordero.
And I'm Janelle Williams-Melendez.
And this has been an episode of the Belonging Chronicles. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe button, alerts too, and follow us if you can online. Right. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
All right, take care, everybody.